welcome back to another episode of MCU Need to Know, a podcast dedicated to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I'm Trey.
I'm Jude. How you doing, Trey?
I am actually doing really well. I'm excited because it's kind of like a peek behind the curtains. A lot of people don't know this, but when I have been doing these episodes, I have been building like a blanket fort to try and make as like little background noise pick upable as possible. And it was killing my back every episode. I actually spent time and like cleared out a space in my closet, and I'm now recording from my closet without having to sit on the floor. And it's already doing wonders for me.
Did you bring a chair into the closet?
I did bring a chair.
Nice.
Yes.
Nice.
Yeah. And I will say this though. I am very conscious about every move I make because this is the squeakiest chair that I could find that could fit in this closet. So I'm trying to be as still as possible.
It's okay.
But I'll take that.
I was going to say, I know behind the curtains, like you listen carefully enough, you're going to hear my chair squirming around. So yeah, you're forgiven.
These are the stories that people look back on like 3 years into their podcast. They're like, hey, do you remember when we used to record in a closet? But yeah, how about you? How you doing?
Doing good. I'm excited to get rolling on this episode. Okay, I was telling you this off podcast, and I'm going to say again, I felt so dejected to start because of that loss I just took on the 2K. But I'm good spirits now, ready to roll.
Oh, and of course, this episode is such a lively, spirited episode too. So it's nothing but up from here.
Oh yeah, like this is such an upbeat, full of warmth and great feeling.
What else do you expect from an episode called In the Blood? But before we dive into it, we do have a little bit of housekeeping. Last week's episode, I did bring up the question about how gratuitous is the violence in Daredevil. I was able to find the article that was first brought up to me. It's from the AV Club. It's called Marvel's Daredevil Rabbit in a Snowstorm by Oliver Sava. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole beginning piece at the beginning, and I want to go ahead and say, one, I already read it wrong, but it still kind of plays into it. Because the quote that stood out to me was, the violence isn't necessarily gratuitous. The bone-popping, head-crushing brutality of the opening sequence with Fisk's hitman, John Healy, in a bowling alley spotlights the cold, terrifying nature of the man that will become Nelson and Murdoch's client, and kind of goes on. And then it just, the kind of crux of its point is, there's a point to the violence, but does it have to be so graphic? There's definitely an oh shit factor in the grotesque moments, but there's little to admire about them.
I was just going to say, like, you sent it to me and I read it, and I thought about, it's hard to think about those two separate, right? When you start talking about what is gratuitous and what is graphic. Cause like I thought about like a Criminal Minds episode, and that can be very graphic for just broadcast television, you know, and if you've ever seen it, it can get very graphic, for broadcast television. But it's the show, you expect that, right? And so in that way, I don't know if you call it necessarily gratuitous. Mm-hmm. And so here in the Daredevil show, as what you just read and kind of pointing out and pushing the characters, I don't know if I want to go to gratuitous.
To kind of play off that, if I'm understanding correctly, maybe it's only seen as gratuitous if we're viewing it in the spectrum of the other Marvel shows that we've watched up to this point. And if it's something we've grown to expect with this, since it is a different take, then because that's kind of the norm for this show, it's not necessarily overdone, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, yeah, okay, so you get the bone snap, you get the sound, he bashes the guy's head in with the skull, the gruesome suicide, impaling. I think I even mentioned in the last podcast, they flip, you know, they get that camera shot where it flips around and you see close up on the face, blood dripping out of the nose. At the time of first watch, when it first came out, I don't remember thinking, man, this is too much. Yeah. Right. It just really had the right amount of, oh crap, kind of factor. But I don't ever remember watching it and thinking, man, this is just pushing it too far.
I'm not someone who's normally sensitive to this kind of stuff. Like, kind of like you, I don't remember it ever sticking out to me through my first watch, but I thought it was an interesting thing to kind of like step back and think about here in this second rewatch. I do think it does kind of linger on it sometimes, like you said, with that scene of him like hanging, and maybe one of the scenes we'll get into in this new episode we're about to discuss, but I don't think it's in an off-putting way. Right.
Well, I guess this is also something maybe to keep in the back of our mind as we go through the episodes, and to see, does that stand out to us at all? You know, and like, oh, this kind of, you were showing it just for the sake of showing it. I know there's some other Netflix Marvel shows that might qualify for the gratuitous more so than what we've seen so far, which you haven't watched this show yet. And so I'm even being hesitant of naming it just because I want you to watch it. And I want you to watch it, and I don't want to put that in your mind when you do go watch it. And your guess is probably right. What is it?
Punisher?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Punisher had one of those things where it was kind of like, it was a very unfortunate time when it was released. If I'm not mistaken, I do believe there was a lot of gun violence going on at the release, and that conversation kind of got paired with the release of the Punisher. So that's kind of like where it stood out to me, but I personally haven't seen the show, so I don't really have informed thoughts one way or the other.
Yeah, coming soon to an MCU Need to Know podcast.
That'll be interesting once we get there.
Maybe not coming soon, but it's coming.
Oh yeah, I'm definitely down to continue going through these Netflix shows. But with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into our topic of the episode, which will be Daredevil Season 1, Episode 4, In the Blood. So immediately we are opened up in a prison. It's a flashback set 8 years ago where we're kind of getting more information about the two Russian brothers, Anatoly and Vladimir. We find out about them, and then it jump cuts to present day where one of the brothers, Anatoly, is fleeing for his life as Daredevil looms overhead watching them from a window.
Right. Two notes I had on the scene. The flashback, again, this one I think served its purpose. And showing how close they were and how tough they need to be to get through that situation. I mean, the guy broke off a rib from a dead body, to show how tough they are. I think what's important also moving forward is you get that of Vladimir and Anatoly. Vladimir is the alpha between the two brothers. And I clearly in my notes, like Daredevil's standing in that window. He's thrown somebody out of the window, and while the camera lingers on him, did this answer the no death, no killing question?
Yeah, I mean, like the same thing I put, like, seriously, Matt does not care about the damage he's doing to people.
Right. Oh, it certainly seems like he doesn't.
But yeah, I mean, to play off what you were saying about getting to know the brothers, I mean, it's kind of, I believe it was last episode where you talked about developing your characters and your villains. The fact that this opener is taking the time to really establish the relationship of the brothers and the things they went through, it only makes what plays out throughout the rest of the episode so much more foreboding, especially given the way that last scene ends. Everything that you feel in that moment is set in stone from this beginning scene where we get to learn how they operate as brothers.
Yes, and when we get to their next scene, that was probably my favorite scene of the whole episode, and just how that was directed and done.
So from there, we get our title sequence, and then when we get back from there, it is another scene featuring Claire and Matt. Claire is tending to Matt's wounds, which we had some off podcast jokes about what we could rename this podcast. I think we might be able to rename it Tending to Wounds, the podcast. It seems like that's a lot of what these scenes are.
Yes, very much. Amateur. Well, it's like amateur medical hour,
Oh man, ER Hell's Kitchen.
Well, I mean, Claire is a nurse, so she knows what she's doing. But
that's true. So anyway, Matt and Claire are Claire's tending to Matt's wounds. They have some kind of flirty back and forth before Matt offers up a phone. That way he establishes that he can call before he comes over next time.
Yeah. Did you get that sense of, to me, I got the sense of disappointment in Claire when the phone was for let's say, business visits. Did you get that sense out of that scene between her or from her?
To me, the way that I read the scene is that they were both kind of like getting into the moment of flirting back and forth. And then the bubble gets popped because she has that like that playful line was like, oh, you shouldn't have, because he handed her the phone, and he laughs, pauses, and he goes, I didn't. And it's like they had this nice like back and forth, and then the reality comes crashing in. He's like, no, this is what it's actually for. So I guess I took it as both of them were kind of coming back down to earth.
Okay. And then this scene, while quick, it did give us one tidbit on Fisk. Just that line right there at the end where he's like, I could find no records on Fisk, internet and whatever. And you would think as a lawyer, he probably has access to some pretty powerful search engines. Yeah.
I mean, it shows just how neatly kept Wilson Fisk is regarding his whereabouts and criminal doings. You know, we talked about it in the beginning, how Matt is definitely very haphazard with the way that he's treating these villains. I wrote down the question, is this the moment that Matt starts to develop his no death rule? Claire is kind of like detailing what has happened to the Russian criminal that they tortured in episode 2. And she's mentioning like, oh, you know, he's in a coma. How do you feel? And Matt says, I'll live. And it's a very cool, a very cold remark given the fact that somebody is in a coma because of his actions.
With the, I'll live line, there was a moment of hesitation there. And so to play off of what you were saying, it seems like maybe, yes, that is where the seeds are starting to be planted. Or at least that internal conflict is now external through Claire's voice.
Very much so. And to play off that, I really like in this scene and in a later scene, Claire is really pushing Matt forward with what his entire plan is. Because she even has kind of like that mocking, so, what's your plan? Are you going to go out there and beat people up until you finally get what you're looking for? And it's just kind of a really grounding conversation that I don't think Matt has truly had up until this point.
Right, and actually thought through, his end game. Mm-hmm. Pun intended.
And regarding that, I mean, what's born out of this scene is another one of the lines that I like to kind of keep as our through line throughout the episode. Matt responds to that question with, apply enough and someone will break. And I like the way that kind of plays out throughout the remainder of this episode.
Right. With that, I think the next scene we get is we're back with the Russians. Is that correct?
That is very much so correct.
So basically Wesley shows up and they're not happy. Fisk isn't happy. Although at this point Wesley's still doing the my employer. But through the scene they mentioned Madame Gao, Nobu, and essentially it's the Russians' inability to handle Daredevil, which is kind of putting a damper on all these criminal activities.
Yeah, definitely a kink has been thrown in their plan. I think the thing I love so much about this scene is, for all the talking that we've been doing about the Murdochs, like, we can take a hit, but we always get back up. I wrote this line down. I think I got it right. But Wesley essentially tells the Russians, I know how much your people love extolling how much pain they can endure, but maybe next time try ducking. The fact that comes from Wesley is like such a great refutation of everything we've been learning about Daredevil. And it's just, I love that it comes from him.
Yes. Well, and also to me, it just showed Wesley's, I mean, he's on their turf and making fun of them, right? He has no fear of them.
I mean, he's in there alone and like, to not only to give this bad news, but basically threaten to be like, hey, we're very close to taking over your operations. And remaining as suave and as intimidating as he is, I said, I'm willing to join on this Wesley fan club with you.
Right. Well, he has also another line in there where, I mentioned Madame Gao and Nobu are not pleased. And the Russians are like, we haven't heard of this. And he's like, well, that's because we're talking behind your back. Wow.
I do like that we get another MCU proper reference in here. As they're kind of going back and forth, being like, hey, this is happening because this man in the black mask is giving us trouble. Wesley does the, if he had an iron suit or a magic hammer, maybe that would explain why you keep getting your asses handed to you. I thought that was the fun little throw up to the MCU.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Now, one of the things I love, because we mentioned this character development of Vladimir and Anatoly, this scene, what I loved about it, it was all about them not being on the same page. Because Anatoly was right away, tell your employer we're grateful, and Vladimir shoots him a look, right? But even the blocking itself, which was really fantastic, because what you had is you had Vladimir between Anatoly and Wesley, right? And you saw Anatoly over Vladimir's shoulder. So you had essentially, Anatoly wanting to make the deal from the beginning, and physically how it was directed, how it was blocked. You had Vladimir in between him and Wesley during that whole exchange, which I thought was just a brilliant piece of directing and blocking throughout that whole scene.
Especially because as the scene prior, we got such a deep look at their history where we saw how they came together to kind of like get over their hardships in the prison. And then to see them starting to split here, things are starting to kind of get tightly wound, and it's not looking good for the way it ultimately plays out. And I think, we can kind of put like a defining moment between their conflict after Wesley leaves, and Anatoly mentions, like, he doesn't mention Fisk by name, and Vladimir insists on saying his name, and he has that line of like, why he doesn't like saying your name? It's because it would betray the idea that he's just a man. And I really like that that exchange there too. You see their conflict kind of verbally stated.
Right. And even leading up to that exchange, what I find interesting is as you're getting to that point and Vladimir is having those lines about saying Fisk, and Vladimir is using Fisk's name, right? The blocking is actually shifted, where Anatoly is now like this peacekeeper position between Wesley and Vladimir, and almost, kind of as a buffer in that moment. And then I thought Wesley had a really cool reaction with his eyes, where you could tell like they got to Wesley right there, and then the way they ended that scene where you had Vladimir and Anatoly facing towards camera and Wesley walking away as he's explaining that, but they still had Wesley between them as he was walking away. So you can clearly see that there was still a divide between them, and Wesley got to them.
Everybody kind of like taking their shots.
Oh, yeah. Now I had a question. Did this give us some insight? Because once on Wesley in a previous episode, because once Wesley got Vladimir to react, in such a way, Wesley kind of flashed this smirk, and it made me wonder, okay, was that flex back in Matt and Foggy's office intentional? Like Wesley enjoys getting people to get wound up or to react. Did you see Wesley as that kind of person, or do you think maybe this answers that question from 2 episodes ago?
Well, I was going to say, I like the way that you brought up that point about how you could see it got to Wesley. I was going to say, does this kind of like give evidence to him slipping in that scene with Foggy and Matt? But it does seem like it's a part of his tool bag to just throw out those lines that are meant to unnerve the person around them. And I think maybe it's a case where with Matt and Foggy, we saw it was effective. And then with here, even though it was effective, he took some disturbance as well by finding out that they knew Fisk's name.
Right. Kind of backfired a little bit, maybe.
It's a point to keep tabs on as we move forward and analyzing the way that Wesley ticks.
It's the Wesley podcast. Okay.
We're going to do our own spin-off. It's going to be a podcast within a podcast. The Wesley Files.
Well, I was going to say one last thing before we move on. Vladimir says, if Fisk, wants a pound of flesh, he can come carve it himself. And I noted down, okay, foreshadowing.
Yeah.
Right here.
I forgot. I do have one more note. I do like that they make the comparison because of playing off that line again. It would portray the idea that he's just a man. And then I believe Anatoly replies, so is the man in the mask. We know everything's kind of building up towards this Daredevil Fisk confrontation. I like that they're comparing them to here. Like they're both these men that represent an idea larger than themselves. Thought that was neat.
Right. No, that's a good catch right there.
But after that, after the business with Wesley and the Russians are done, we get a new scene featuring Karen and Ben. They are in a diner and they are seated discussing Union Allied. And, Ben is very apprehensive and kind of poking holes in Karen's case and basically giving her every reason not to chase down this lead.
Right. And I found it interesting. You made a note in the last podcast where the last interaction we had between Ben and Karen in his office, Ben had this hopeful look that he could carry on this Union Allied story. And this seems like an interesting turn here, at least in the initial, right here in the scene, the way I read it. I felt like he had moved on. He was done. Yeah. He wasn't going to look at it.
So for me, I think the thing that I come away with is that, obviously we know he's someone that takes pride in reporting on real stories and, how much that means to him. And so, like you said, it's interesting that when this story does come to him, despite it being what he wants, he's still trying to take that realist approach. As you mentioned last week, he has these responsibilities. He has to keep his job so that he can take care of his wife. And so it almost feels like he's arguing against himself via Karen. And so I wrote down the question, do you think that Ben was swayed in this conversation, or was he always trying to shield Karen from getting involved?
In the moment, I feel like he wasn't interested. And the way I read this scene, and he was persuaded, maybe. And honestly, the only reason why I say and he was persuaded is because we know, or he shows up later in another scene and he's pursuing it. Otherwise, this scene alone, I think I even wrote my note here, right? We find something out about Karen, she has a shady past, and then she brings up, well, I've researched into you, I've read your old stories. And his response to me was believable that he had moved on, especially if I take into account the conflict from the previous episode. Do I write the hard-hitting news piece that doesn't sell, or do I write the fluff piece that does sell? And knowing what's going on with his wife, to me, it was a believable that he moved on, mentally, emotionally, from doing that kind of work and accepted doing fluff pieces.
Yeah. And he has like this, you could feel how tired he is. Like, I think maybe there is a part of him that wants to do it, but like you said, taking into account all of his responsibilities, I think he does realize that, it's something that he does need to move on from. Because I think the line that you're referring to is when Karen pushes back, she's like, you basically took down the Italian mob when I was still in diapers. Whatever happened to that reporter, Mr. Urich? And he says he got old and a whole hell of a lot less stupid. And I thought that was a pretty good punctuation on that entire scene.
Yeah, and that's why I say it's believable that he's not taking it up. And that's how I read it.
One more question, because I was a little confused on this, because they're kind of like pushing back and forth. And he goes, I did some investigation into your past activities. What activities was he referring to? Do we know?
I know.
Okay. Oh, man. I guess this is something that I've forgotten.
No, it's not something you've forgotten. They don't actually explore her past in this season. Eventually, they do get to exploring Karen's past, and they're pulling from, I want to say, the Born Again storyline.
Okay.
And it's not directly, but the idea of a shady past. And the majority of this is pulled from that storyline, like piecemeal. You get some of it here, then you get in the different seasons, and a lot of that Frank Miller run. But so yeah, like they brought that up, but I don't think they actually explore it until later seasons.
Okay. All right. Well, then I will put a pin on this and something we can come back to as I get caught up. After Ben and Karen have their discussion at the diner, our next scene involves the Russian brothers arriving at a hospital where we get to see the results of Matt's torture of the Russian criminal on the rooftops. And the Russian brothers awaken him to get information out of him, and they are able to pull out enough information to find Claire's old apartment, where unfortunately they also find Santino.
Right. So I do have one question. So they reconcile, as I mentioned, they were not on the same page. They had a moment of like, okay, we want to be on, they get on the same page, over over the body that's in a coma. And I had a note, and I wanted to ask you, like, how responsible is Daredevil for this death? Because I read it as he died, and they wake him up from the coma, and on his dying breath, they give up the names. So if he did die, yes, they brought him out of the coma, but those injuries were from Daredevil,
Most definitely.
So I don't know. What do you think? How much of that is on him?
I mean, because I've been kind of keeping tabs on this throughout these episodes. Like it's baffling to me how much little care Matt has shown to the people that he's taking down. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this is the episode where we're seeing that as he's starting to kind of define what his end game is. And I think even if it's not stated in the text, I think this is where he is getting that no death rule. And I think I would say, yeah, he's pretty damn responsible for getting this guy in the hospital bed, even though it was the Russians who woke him up. Matt was the one who put him there in the first place.
Right. I'd have to agree with you on that. Because we looked at that scene pretty well, I feel, in terms of just, wow, he just threw that guy over the edge. And we talked about whether or not the line was, going for the cheap laugh, or did he really not care? And I think we both concluded that he didn't care,
Yeah. And I think this kind of just popped up in my head. What did he say in that rooftop scene? He says, he'll live. And we revisit that same person again at the beginning of this episode, and his same response is, I'll live. So it's shifting from like, he's starting to take personal responsibility for it, I think. Even though it's kind of a coy response, I think you can kind of dig into the subtext and realize that it's starting to weigh on Matt for sure. Right.
He's making moves in that direction for sure.
The only other thing I wanted to point out, because I found it unintentionally hilarious, or maybe it was intentional, I don't know, that you can weigh in on this. I do find it funny that when Vladimir and Anatoly arrive at the hospital, they're carrying balloons and flowers, but there is not a single body language in them that seems like they're remorseful. They're purely on business, and everything else is just props.
Well, it was a nice touch, I think, to at least on their part, to like try to make it look like they were visiting and cared. I don't know if you saw them walking through with the bruised faces and beat up as they were, that you would look at it and think, oh, that's how sweet, they're visiting someone.
And I do have one more note, because obviously the scene ends where the Russian henchmen get to Claire's old apartment and they find Santino. Man, Santino definitely wins the award for being in the wrong place at the wrong times multiple times this season. That poor kid.
After this, I'm sure he's going to be an introvert or an antisocial.
He's like, you know what? I'm just going to stay home. I don't want to go out anymore. After we get the scene with the Russian henchman finding Santino, we find ourselves back with Wesley and Fisk as they are riding together in a vehicle. They're basically just giving a rundown of their day and how things are going with the Russian brothers, as well as the man in the black mask. When they do arrive at their location, Wesley wants to tag along with Fisk, but Fisk insists that he visits alone because, as we find out, they have returned to the art exhibit to continue his conversation with the woman in the art gallery.
So at the beginning of this scene, there's a bit of business first in the car, where Wesley has clearly picked up on Vladimir and Anatoly not being on the same page and suggest to Fisk we should use Anatoly to make some sort of deal.
Yeah, I mean, it just goes to show the kind of right-hand man that Wesley is. He's, as we've said multiple times, I mean, he's very good at what he does. And I think the thing that I like the most out of this scene is it may seem trivial, but I like that this is the first time, correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is the first time that we've seen Wesley without his glasses as he's talking to Fisk. I like the kind of imagery that this depicts, that they have that kind of casual relationship where this is like, it's at the end of their day, they're kind of relaxing a little bit while just tuning up these fine little details for what they need to do next. Felt very casual.
The casualness is a nice catch, because I just mentioned how they did a piece of business, but you see that it's not all business for them, and in a sense that relationship has some deeper meaning. Well, I mean,
it's a level of trust.
Well, yeah, because like Fisk gets out to go to the end of the art gallery, and Wesley was like, "Sir," and wants to do it for him. And so you see that level of trust. You see that Wesley. You get the sense that Wesley truly cares for Fisk. It's not just a job.
Which, again, I know I keep saying this. I can't remember exactly how things play out with Wesley, but these slow buildups are making me really excited to see how his story continues on.
Yeah, I remember. So
the second half of the scene really involves Fisk getting to know the woman. I believe we learn her name is Vanessa, and Fisk is attempting to ask her out on a date. Man, I have gone back and forth so many times on my notes about how I feel about Fisk in this episode. He openly admits that this isn't something that he does often, but it almost feels clumsy. But I think it's intended for effect given how things are going to play out by the end. I just don't ultimately know where I land on it.
Right. Well, I think it was. I think the clumsiness was intentional because, I mean, you'll notice Wesley was going to get out and go in, and Fisk wanted to do it himself. And she had that line, "You don't do this often." No, I don't. And so even the dialogue plays into that. So I think you're right to catch on that. We noted at the end of the episode, Rabbit in a Snowstorm, his only line was "makes me feel alone," right? This sense of vulnerability. And we have such a powerful, expectation-wise, such a powerful businessman who's pulling all these strings, and yet we still see him in a vulnerable and shy, awkward position. So in that way, I think it's just really good character building.
I recognize that it definitely is for effect. It's just, I don't know. I think I have more to touch on later in some of their dating scenes, but I guess we can get to that when we get to it.
Well, and if that's the thing they go for, they did well, because I have a note that all it says is Fisk gets a date. You know, like you feel like you're watching, you know, as a teacher, it's like watching one of my students bumble through trying to get a date, and then like, oh, you're so proud of them. You got a date.
you know, it's very funny that you point that out, because I think one of the, it's in a later scene, but I think one of the notes that I wrote was like, this feels very high school to me, which again, for effect, but yeah. I like your perspective of like, you almost feel proud for them because you know this isn't something that happens often. Oh, man. So after Fisk gets his date, we do get ourselves a new scene with Claire where we see her taking care of her friend's cat. It's a very chilling scene where she hears something outside, and after checking it, realizing that it's just a neighbor walking by, but unbeknownst to her, we the viewer see that there is somebody at her window, and it's this looming sense of dread. They interject that scene with Matt and Foggy, who are tending to their business, and they're kind of like going over their life choices about starting their own practice. And the scene ends with Matt getting a very harrowing call from Claire, realizing that there was somebody outside her window.
Right. And from that, he springs into action and does his fancy blind man parkouring, and, you know, doesn't get there in time. Okay, let me go back. You mentioned, I thought that was a really well done sequence where they set up that expectations of, you expected the Russians outside the door. You didn't get it. And they went back to that restraint in that moment where they give you the menacing moment outside the window, but they don't pay it off, you know, which is in a horror kind of genre. Like, that's some of the scariest ways to do it.
Right. Because it's all about the buildup and the catharsis, and the fact that they're delaying the catharsis of the scene. It just really amplifies the effect of what they're doing. Because, I mean, my only note for the specific scene with Claire in the apartment with the cat, this genuinely freaked me out. The way, I don't know what it was, but the way that the person outside the window was moving just felt so unnatural. And it genuinely creeped me out. Right.
And you kind of, the way they did this sequence, you kind of get a sense of relief, right? Because Matt gets the phone call and he's not panicked right away. He says, hold on. He finishes the conversation with Foggy. Foggy makes that crack about, oh, can you afford a phone? It's a phone just for your women now. And then when he comes back, Claire, what's wrong? Then we get that quick cut back to her apartment, and she's scrambling for her phone. And it's a really quick moment. You don't see a lot of her being taken. And then Matt, like I said, you know, springs into action. So, like, it was really well done in that, like, we're going to set you up, not going to give it to you, even give you the phone call, and kind of let it linger a little bit before we hit you with that, oh, something's going down.
I do want to play off what you said about Matt and his parkour sequence. Maybe you can enlighten me a little bit on this, but as far as at least my read and my only knowledge of Daredevil being through the show, the poison that Matt was infected with as a kid only damaged his sight and enhanced his other senses, right? Or did he get any other sort of enhanced abilities from that? Because the parkour, I mean, that's some incredible skill that he's displaying.
Right. No, he has an extreme. He is extremely athletic. So it honestly, it depends on what comic run you're looking at. If you're looking at like originally, you do have some. If I remember right, if you look at the original creation of Daredevil, you do get some sense, or I think they do have some kind of heightened ability in terms of like naturally gifted, not mutant or anything like that, but he would have had some of these things even if he wasn't blind necessarily. Is if I remember right the thought. Whereas when I keep bringing Frank Miller, when they kind of did a redo of this, and like there was a big change, right? Like in the original creation of this, Matt's dad didn't die till he was older, right? Like in college, older, whereas when they redid it with the Frank Miller run, and you're looking at the Man Without Fear run, Matt's dad was, I believe, abusive and an alcoholic.
Oh, wow.
And right. And so it was much darker. And so you get, somebody will be introduced later to in a couple of episodes where he like takes Matt and trains Matt in how to use these senses. So it's a mix of both, but I think that this show is following more of that run of he was taught what to do with these senses. You and I listen to a lot of podcasts, and there's one podcast from NPR, Invisibilia, and they're like season 1, episode 2 or 3 talks about the Batman, and it talks about someone who's blind and uses echolocation to basically for him to see. In that episode, it talked about how, yes, even though I was blind, I had to learn how to use these senses, and with enough time, I was able to hone these things. And I think that's the direction they're taking with this. Now, Matt also is just naturally athletically gifted, which helps.
I mean, because the note I was going with is the fact that he's so agile and adept at combat is just a testament to how cool the character he is. If that's kind of more self-trained versus gifted from the accident.
Well, speaking of that athleticism, there's some issues where like he even dressed up as Spider-Man and pretended to be Spider-Man for Peter Parker and vice versa. And so you have to have a pretty, to not have those spider powers, you have to have a pretty good athletic ability to do that.
No joke. And that's actually really cool to know, because when you were talking about how he didn't necessarily become a mutant, I was going to say it's kind of Peter Parker-esque, the natural reflexes that were enhanced from that. So that's cool to know that there was a run where he, took over for Spider-Man for a little bit.
Yeah.
The only other note that I really have for this is I really do enjoy that the conversation that Matt and Foggy are having really mirrors one that we're going to have later with Claire and Matt. Foggy kind of embodies so perfectly that feeling of not knowing if you're doing the right thing, and how not knowing only exasperates that feeling. Matt reassuring that they're still making a difference as defending the little people and being, good lawyers. It helps to kind of keep this in check for later on scenes down the road, because it's the fact that Matt's defending Foggy's feelings kind of educates the audience that despite the insecurity, it's still worth pursuing the chance to make a difference.
Yes, I think that's a good way to look at their interaction. And the only thing I was going to say as well, my last note, watching it now versus when it came out, I couldn't help but think of just that trope, women in refrigerators, that comic trope of how women are just used as a plot point to push a male character storyline. And I'll have to admit, watching that now, I don't know if I want to go so far as to say it turned me off to the episode the rest of the way, but it did really change how I looked at the Matt and Claire storyline for the rest of this episode.
to play off what you said about how the trope of using women to just propel the story forward, if kind of peeking ahead, I mean, we don't really glean too much off of the rest of Claire and Matt's story. And it is kind of an unfortunate reliance on that trope in this episode.
Right. Especially, I mean, the next scene is Karen at the auction. She shows up to the auction because she decided she's pushing forward to do this research on Union Allied. And what you get with that, and her seemingly walking away from Ben thinking like this isn't going to happen and taking her own, is that sense of agency, right? She's driving the action. Which is interesting to see, that you actually have both the trope and then you play right into the other, where you have a female character who has some sense of agency. And I mean, yeah, there's a sense of she's reacting, right? Because of the beginning and everything that she's been through, but she's not letting it go, right? Like, she's making the choice to pursue this.
Even if she doesn't have experience in a situation like this, that's such a cool character defining moment that she's still out there, still trying to make leads. I mean, we can even look down to the single fact, like, look at what she was doing. Her way of gathering notes was just drawing sketches. Like, I don't think she necessarily knew what she was looking for. She just wanted to know that she had a record of the people that she was seeing there. It shows how new she is to this, but still willing to kind of go off into the deep end.
Oh, yeah. Like, well, and that we've been talking this whole theme of justice, right? Matt, two versions of justice and this conflict. Ben, Eric, and this idealist version of justice. And she's clearly going to be paired well with Ben, because this has to be, these people have to face justice. This can't be let go.
The pairing with Ben is so great, because I always like that. Someone taking someone under their wing to kind of train them to do the thing that they really want to do. And we're seeing that with Ben and Karen. And we're getting it in a way that the way they kind of like stage the scene, Ben is pointing out all these people he's suspicious of, but despite the fact that he doesn't have concrete information on them, he's still savvy enough to know what to look for and how to remain anonymous. And him trying to like impart that information on to Karen was cool.
Oh yeah, and you get the sense that he's done this before, because he was able to say, okay, you need to stay around, bid a few things, win a small lot, just to help her not stand out and not get caught. So to have that know-how and be able to so quickly pass it on, there was a nice interaction between them two.
Yeah, and also we get to see Ben basically be Batman, which is amazing.
Yes, my note. Vanishes like Batman. in fact, I even paused the episode to make sure I wrote that down.
That is the first note that I took. Ben is basically Batman. I think we're finding out Wesley and Ben might be our two favorite characters in this show.
Yes.
So after Ben imparts his wisdom onto Karen, we do get another scene with Claire in hands of the Russians. They take her back to their base of operation. And meanwhile, Matt, still high on the chase, finds himself in the apartment with Santino, and they have a discussion so that he can figure out just exactly where Claire is. I just want to say right off the bat, Matt's Spanish is pretty good. I didn't know that he had it in him. I thought that was cool.
Yeah, like he's obviously very intelligent.
Yeah. So I do want to say this, though. I mentioned the point about how we have that line about apply enough pressure and eventually they'll break. I'd like that this is another example of that. And I love that when Matt said it, he was in no way thinking about how it would be applied to him. But as we've seen so far in this episode, they're really throwing that line back in his face. Pair this back with the conversation with Claire, and we're really starting to see the rules develop even further for himself.
I'm going to jump ahead here just slightly, where towards the end, there is a scene where Matt has this line of, I didn't think about how this would impact others.
Mm-hmm.
And just to play off that pressure being applied to him, that's... I mean, clearly, that's how they're applying that pressure on him, like through other people.
I mean, because you saw how distraught Santino was. He's like, I'm sorry, it's my fault. I broke, they were threatening to hurt my family if I didn't give him the information. And he just felt so guilty.
You got to imagine that kid's was a high schooler. In the past few days, he has helped carry a person out of a dumpster, then carry somebody up flights of stairs to a roof, and then have somebody show up and beat him for information. He's had a rough couple of days.
Not to mention probably all the homework he's got. Juggling that and this vigilante stuff. Poor Santino is basically, I felt so bad for him.
Yes, very much so.
After Matt gets that information out of Santino, we do find ourselves back with Wilson and Vanessa on their date. The two are getting to know each other, and we get a closer look at Fisk and his motivations. We learn that Fisk dreamed about living far away, and then once he was kind of shipped off far away, he had this forlonging sense of Hell's Kitchen and how he wanted to make it a better place.
One of the things I found interesting about this is he's being built up as this big, powerful man. And maybe it's just my perception, but when he goes to choose the wine and then says, well, no, it's Wesley, he's the one that recommended it. For some reason, I had it in my head. Like there's a sense of sophistication that he has. And like they're using him choosing the right wine to kind of express that. And then it's just another example of this vulnerability that he's like, yeah, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm going off of Wesley's recommendation. And then, they show that it doesn't seem like he has much of a sense of humor because he didn't really take her joke very well.
No, not at all. You could see how much his ego is hurt. Because, I mean, she has to immediately defend it. She's like, not a good joke, I imagine. Because my notes start off with saying more clunky and awkward Fisk. And I think on paper, I really do love the idea of getting to know our character by seeing them going on a first date. I mean, because it's an interesting way to kind of see what makes them tick, what their motivations are. And I guess maybe it's just either the conversation or the delivery, it just feels so unnatural. Like it doesn't feel like a real conversation to me. And I think that's what makes me like conflicted about the efficacy of Wilson's awkwardness.
You know what? This awkwardness of the date has really, really got you thinking, or like focused in on that. Because what I really expected you to say, or to bring up, Vanessa asks or says something like, "You don't do this often," and his line, something to the effect. She says something to the effect of that, and then his line is, "I've been preoccupied for a long time." And as he's saying that, they start with a close-up of that cufflink and him rubbing it with his hand. And as much as you brought up the cufflink with the last episode, I figured you would have like really focused in on that. But this awkwardness has really kind of got your attention.
I don't know what it is, man. I don't know. Maybe it speaks more about me than anything. But yeah, I did see the scene where he starts fiddling with his cufflink, and it almost feels like it's a nervous habit for him. And I really, again, I don't remember, but I really do want to see if we get some more light shed on what these cufflinks mean to him.
It has to have something, and I'm sure it does. And I just honestly don't remember, right? Like I'm not holding back of like, I honestly, it's been a while since I've seen them all. And this is that little detail that I'm not remembering. What I do find interesting is he does get across his love for the city. Yeah. And I do want to note that because he's trying to improve it. He loves the city. We had a whole episode, with Karen and Foggy talking about how much they love the city, so you do get a sense that he does, or he is doing what he's doing because he believes it's right.
Yeah, I mean, he genuinely does care for his city. And to two things I want to point out here is me jumping ahead a little bit. We kind of get that same feeling from Matt as well. I mean, Matt lists how he genuinely wants to make his city a better place. For example, last episode when he was beating up on that guy who had the leverage on the juror, he was like, "I don't want to see you in my city again." Like he takes ownership of where he lives. And it's very cool that we get to see this contrast between the two of them, how they have similar goals. It's obviously they're just going about it in different ways. And then the second point when I bring up, I don't think, and because I'm making a reference to the MCU proper here, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that Thanos is probably one of the more successful villains in the MCU proper. And I like that he was grounded in that same belief of like, he's genuinely under the impression that he's doing good. Like he wants to make the world a better place. And I find it interesting that Fisk, another really highly renowned villain in the MCU, has similar grounding as a villain.
Yeah, and I thought of T'Challa and Eric Killmonger, where they both had this, true sense of, I want to do what's right, and by different means.
So after the dating scene with Wilson and Vanessa, we do find ourselves back with Claire, who is incredibly beaten up and bloodied. She's being interrogated because the Russians are trying to find out the identity of the man in the black mask. And of course, she's not giving it up. And right before things get too out of hand, he does arrive and single-handedly incapacitates all the Russians.
We start this scene with this empty frame, a bloodied face. Claire falls into it, right? And it's a very jarring moment for when I was watching it. And then we proceed with the torture, the beating. And honestly, if I think back, a lot of it seemed implied, because he hit the car window with a bat. You get this sense of fear, but I don't.
Yeah, we never actually.
I don't know if you actually go ahead. I don't think you actually see it.
No, you don't see any actual physical violence towards Claire as far as I'm concerned. She's definitely bloodied up and bruised, and they have that intimidation scene with the bat. But as far as I remember, no, they don't actually lay a hand on her. But God, dude, that scream that she had was brutal when they broke the window by her head. That, regardless of where we go from here, that's some amazing acting on... I just lost her name. I had it.
Rosario Dawson.
Rosario Dawson. That's some amazing acting on Rosario Dawson's part.
Yes. Well, and again, as just all the way through, because you're right. Now that I think about it, like I just kept focusing in on they're really like, this is brutal. Like she just is taking a beating, but it's more like she took a beating. I don't know if they showed it.
Yeah.
Like, so, I mean, maybe it helps answer that question. It's not that graphic, gratuitous question.
Yeah, it definitely would have been clear-cut gratuitous if they would have been showing it, but they did have some restraint in that regard. I think the thing that I like about this scene the most, and it's something that we've already kind of distinguished between in the first episode, is that this show is so good at giving us two different modes of Daredevil. We have scenes like that hallway scene where we have the perspective of the fight from him and we get to feel the weight of the fight. And then we have scenes like this one where it's from the perspective of the criminals, and it's truly haunting. Like the way that he's just this force that is unstoppable compared to them.
Oh, the laugh from Claire, I think, added to that. The lights go out, she knows what's about to happen. She figures it out. And that laugh she gives out and said, why don't you ask him yourself? And then you get he goes through them fairly quick. I found it interesting how they ended it. She's taken at gunpoint and Daredevil makes that threat. But the threat was interesting because the threat was to basically, you need to drop the gun or I'm going to break your hand, which I think pushes along that narrative. You're talking about the no death code, right? It wasn't like you need to drop the gun or you'll be sorry or anything. It was very specific. I'm going to break the hand, not I'm going to kill you or anything like that.
Yeah, that's a good catch. Yeah.
And then, of course, Claire gets, and I'm conflicted on this, Claire gets some kind of redemption. She's the one that gets to kind of do the final hit with the baseball bat. And I don't know, I go back and forth because they end that where they clearly in this, they embrace, right? Because they know each other. And then she kind of breaks down and cries. And again, like I said, it kind of colored how I saw the rest of it. Because my note just, they embrace, she cries, feel like, I can't read my own handwriting. Basically, I wrote down, says, it feels like they gave her that to kind of make up, like show creators gave her that moment to kind of like, we need to make up for what we put her through. Mm-hmm. But I also kind of wrote down, but that moment of the embrace, and her breaking down, it was like, yep, right there. They put her in the fridge, and that was kind of that final sealing of it for me.
It's like wanting to have your cake and eat it too, kind of thing. Like their recognition of what they're doing, but they thought they could nullify it by giving her that moment at the end.
Right. And I'm glad she got that moment, but
yeah,
it was hard for me not to see it in another way.
Mm-hmm. No, I definitely appreciate that perspective that you're bringing to it. I mean, for me, honestly, that scene broke my heart. Like, we know Claire is like this medical professional. She's taken this oath to care for people. And even though these truly heinous acts have been done to her, it takes a lot to get to that point where you openly take a bat to somebody's face. And then to see that immediate effect that it has on her, it's just like, I don't know. It broke me a little bit to see her go through all that.
Well, and you get the continuing transition, like you've already brought it up, and we'll talk about it again in just a little bit. So I'm just kind of a tease, but where she starts urging him on, you got to continue. And I have to imagine this experience maybe reinforced that thought of you need to be doing this.
Last little note that I want to put out here is I found it interesting in that scene where the Russian brothers visit Simon in the hospital, and the information that they're able to get out of him is just simply the devil. Mm-hmm. I don't want to trivialize torture, but I will say I never took anything happening in that scene as somebody who would resort to like this supernatural, like, oh, the devil did this kind of thing. To me, Matt really earned the name devil in this scene. The way that they did it all haunting and making him larger than life. It's very clear to see why Simon referred to him as the devil.
Right. No, I think that's a really good point.
After that scene, we do find ourselves once again with Karen and Ben as they reconvene at the diner that they were at previously. Karen's kind of like pushing Ben to be like, hey, I thought you didn't want to be in on this. And he starts to lay the ground rules for how he will find himself involved in this, but they have to be careful. Yeah,
we learn a little bit about Ben here, because Karen starts asking, what about, well, no. She doesn't start asking. Ben starts telling her about what happened to the people that gave him the tips. And the last one, I think the VA hospital, he asked, well, what happened to that person? And, it was clearly implied that was his wife, yeah. and it was also, with that line, she married, but suffered the worst fate. She married beneath her. And you can tell that like he has this remorse of, or this, this guilt that like his wife is in that situation she's in because she's with me.
It's a very self-deprecating view and a nice insight onto who he is as a person. And to kind of play on what you were saying about how the way he's listing the different ways that the people he got sources from suffered pretty terrible fates, we get that further sense of why Ben is trying to keep Karen at bay. He does have an enthusiasm for getting the truth, but he does understand that there are risks involved.
Right. Now, I want to shift gears just a little bit and ask you, have you ever been to one of those auctions like Karen was at?
I have not.
Okay, neither have I. And I'm just, for the time and the setting of when this takes place, it just seems that like that auction either took a very long time because it's at night, or it was a weird time to have an auction late in the evening. Like I don't know when auctions normally take place, but
right.
But that setting just really struck me as odd.
Maybe it was just Karen was just like freaking out, wondering where she was going to get the money for the stuff she had bought.
Yeah, just like it's nighttime. And you just finished the auction. Like he had to have been sitting in the diner for a while.
It's not his first plate of pancakes that he's had that night.
No.
I joke about that, but actually, I'm totally aware of that old trope about how like, sometimes the curtains are just blue. There's no meaning to be derived from it. But I really enjoyed that in this first diner scene that we had where Ben is standoffish. He doesn't want to be a part of it. He only drinks a cup of coffee. But then when we get this second scene where he does finally say, okay, I'm in, he's got himself like a full meal. I thought that was just a cool visual representation to show his shift in decision making.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of like the catch of Wesley in the glasses. It's just a little bit more, he's more comfortable, more casual.
Yeah.
I like, it's interesting that we are gravitating towards Ben and Wesley, as you mentioned, because they're both very principled people. Now they clearly have very different principles that they, try to uphold, but they're very, clearly principled, know what they're doing kind of people. Or well, it's more thought through than Daredevil. In terms of, what we brought up about what is your end game.
I guess they're more defined in their experience. They're people who have been at it long enough to know who they are, and therefore what they represent is less wild, I would say. I don't know if that's a great way to characterize Daredevil, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, wild, or you even mentioned he seems like, was it last podcast episode? No, last podcast episode is Rabbit in a Snowstorm. You mentioned in the one where he threw him over the roof, where he just seems to be a little bit, especially in the no death clause, very haphazard with some of the stuff he's doing.
Mm-hmm. After we get that scene in the diner, we are back with Vladimir and Anatoly as they arrive back at their operations just to discover all the damage that Daredevil has caused. Anatoly receives word that Fisk has been spotted out in the open. He insists that him and his brother go make a deal, but Vladimir refuses. Anatoly goes alone. Meanwhile, Fisk and Vanessa are discussing dessert, but are interrupted by Anatoly arriving.
There's a quick moment there between the brothers where Anatoly says, I'm going to go ask for the deal. Vladimir, I will not bow before that man. And Anatoly, then I will go and bow for both of us. And then Vladimir says, go make the deal. I mean, you can tell that they're, as we mentioned before, they're not on the same page, trying to get on the same page. You have a small interaction and small play between the brothers, in terms of their character development, and that's that quick bit.
Mm-hmm. I will say this, though, because I believe you've alluded to it already before. I will allude to it now. I think Anatoly should have chose his words a little bit better.
Yes.
I have a feeling he's going to regret saying I will bow for the both of us come before the episode ends. I do, once they have their little exchange back and forth about the going to make the deal, we do have ourselves with Vanessa and Fisk, and they're having a conversation where Fisk says something to the line of, we get caught up in what we're doing, who we think we are. I like that this prefaces the scene of Anatoly interrupting their dinner, continuing that thread of just how vulnerable Wilson is. I think he truly dropped all his defense here. Like, he was being as open as he possibly could with Vanessa, and I do think that he forgot who he thought he was before reality comes crashing and Anatoly burst in.
Oh, completely. Because, as he says that line, I didn't even write this down, but I just remember it. There was a slow camera push in, and then Vanessa asked the question, who are you? And so you could tell this is like a real poignant moment, like we're going to get some insight. And his response is, tonight I'm just a man. Well, he goes on with the date part with a beautiful woman, but for me, the more important part, tonight I'm just a man. And as you mentioned before, we've already had that line of Vladimir saying, the reason why you don't want him to say the name is because then he is just a man. And so tonight I'm just a man. So I thought it was a good, and right there is where he get interrupted. But even the start of that scene where he offers the Zupa Iglesia, the Zupa. Iglesia. We'll go with that. Yeah, and her first crack back at him was that, isn't that served at children's birthday parties? And to me, it was kind of a weirdly veiled shot of you're kind of childlike, So I thought that was also a little interesting tidbit on the Fisk character, of that being the favorite dessert.
Mm-hmm. That's a good catch. I didn't quite put that together, or the I'm just a man. So yeah, that's cool for pointing that out.
Well, yeah, because you mentioned sometimes is there not, is there not any meaning, and we're just deriving some meaning in it. But that is the second reference this episode to his childhood, through this date. And so that's part of why I thought it was significant of kind of that call into the childhood, where he was away from the city for those years. So they were good years, and now through the dessert.
Yeah, it's a great way to show the building rage that we know is coming.
Now, one of the things I didn't mention in the last scene of the date, intentionally, I saved it for now. One of the things I noticed, they said it's a new restaurant, and I was like, oh, it's a new restaurant. It's awfully full for a new restaurant. And then when Anatoly comes crashing in, that reality you said it comes crashing, you very quickly see that the majority of those people in there are Fisk's people.
Yeah.
You know, and I had two thoughts that, A, wow, like he had the place locked down, and B, the way they showed it, it looked like they were with people having dinner. And so like, I'm just imagining, like, if I put myself in that world, like, yeah, honey, we're going to go out to this new Italian restaurant. And then Judy calls and you're left there with your date or wife sitting there, you know, because it looked like normal people for the most part.
Mm-hmm. You know what it almost kind of harkens back to? That scene in the Avengers when Natasha is sent to recruit Banner and she's like, no, it's just me. And then when Banner does that fake out about raging out and the scene pulls out and you see all the agents outside the building, a very similar feel.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. And honestly, that wasn't something that I caught until the third rewatch. Cause like it all happened so quickly, but then once you catch on to the way that they all stand up and are part of his posse, it's like, oh wow. The mirage comes shattering.
Yeah, and honestly, the only note I have left of this scene is just that quick interchange as they're getting away. You know, Fisk says, "Put him in the car." Wesley says, "Understood," and then I have a note: Anatoly's a dead man.
Yeah, the venom in Fisk's voice was palpable.
Yes.
So, after the dinner gets interrupted, we do find ourselves back in the Nelson and Murdoch offices. Karen has just arrived and she is discussing with Foggy all the purchases that she has made. And she's kind of begging for forgiveness, but we see that it has a very different effect on Foggy.
Right. And well, as quick a scene as this is, and I didn't really think much about it. And, you know, you brought it up nicely of there's a payoff, right? The only other scene we have with Foggy, you know, he brings up, he's telling the story about mom wanting him to become a butcher. I want fax machines and elevators and all that comes along with big law firm, you know? And so there's a nice little payoff there that it's fax machines that Karen ends up buying from that auction.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a serendipitous effect that it has on Foggy. And I mean, because I mean, they really are questioning their decisions up until that point of whether or not they made the right move to start their own practice. And I mean, even think about it this way. This kind of popped in my head, so it might not be fully formed. You know, they're questioning if they're doing the right thing. What's the first case that they took on? It was bringing in Karen, and then Karen brings in these office supplies. And I just thought it was a nice little way to kind of keep them going on their moral compass.
It is. And they do, and I think it was a good way to include Foggy in this episode. Because, I mean, you think about it, that's all we've seen of Foggy. You know, where Karen had a lot of scenes with Ben, you know, Claire, but you don't get much of Foggy, but it actually was short, but added something to him and who he is and what he wants out of life and what they're doing.
Which, to play off that, our next scene features Matt and Claire, which, in a stunning turn of events, is a role reversal. Matt is tending to Claire's wounds, and they begin to open up a lot more to the point that Matt reveals his name.
Yeah, so you mentioned that Matt gives his name. I mean, this is a full reveal, right? Not just his name, but they're in his apartment. And this is where we've alluded to it a couple of times now, where Claire is in the position of convincing Matt that, yes, you are doing the right thing and being a vigilante.
Almost definitely. I mean, because Matt, he straight up says nothing's changing out there. Matt is starting to feel like what he's doing doesn't have any effect, kind of similar to Foggy. And I mean, it's showing it's easy to break when it feels like the things you're doing aren't make a difference. I do find it interesting that in the beginning scene, the first scene that we get with Matt and Claire, it kind of makes that suggestion like, well, hey, maybe the guy that gave you Fisk's name was lying. And Matt says, I would have known. And she goes, how? And he goes, heartbeat. And she kind of just like rolls her eyes and is like, okay, whatever. Not that she was skeptical of his power, but just kind of like, just throwing it away. And the way that she kind of reinforces how much she believes in what he's doing is a callback to that heartbeat. She's like, feel my heartbeat. And she's like, you are making a difference. You have to keep on doing this, but you have to be smart about the way that you're doing it.
Yeah, they did a good job of starting the episode. I mean, I realize there's another scene, but at least with their story, right, of starting the episode and just mirroring that end with this scene. We're in Claire's place. Now we're in Matt's place. Matt's getting, patched up. Now Claire's getting patched up. The heartbeat, as you just mentioned, on either side. It's a nice bookend for this, for their story for this episode.
And I mean, we've kind of discussed this throughout because we've kind of been peeking ahead a little bit, but I just want to hammer the point home a little bit more. This is Matt's guilt finally coming to a head. And I think it's an incredible contrast from the beginning with the "I'll live" line to where he's now realizing the effects that his actions are having on the people that he's roping in on this. And it's great work that they're doing, that they're contrasting both Matt and Fisk, who are these people that just want to make their city a better place. And I like that we have Claire in Matt's corner being like, okay, well, that's good, but how are you going to do it? You need to have a more realistic approach to this.
Right. What's your end game?
So I thought that was a point to just hammer home as we move into the next place, which does find us at the conclusion of Fisk and Vanessa's date. They're standing outside of their apartment. They're kind of reassessing how the date went, and Vanessa is unsure about how she feels about who Fisk is and everything that happened in the restaurant.
Okay, I'm going to start with a question for you.
Okay.
If the date didn't end the way it ended, right? Let's say Anatoly doesn't barge in, and he's a little bit more diplomatic. Do you think Fisk kills Anatoly?
Oh, dang. That's my initial inclination is to say no, but I'm peeking ahead a little bit here without getting into the details of what happened. At the end of the scene, Fisk basically tips his hand that he's counting on the fallout effects of what happens when he kills Anatoly. So
right, and that seems planned, and so that's why I kind of questioned, would he have done it anyways?
But that's a good call. Maybe the difference is, I think Anatoly was always going to die, but the manner in which he dies is different because of the outlash that Fisk has because Anatoly barged in on his date.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because it almost, and I know we haven't laid out the details yet, so I'm going to tread lightly, but it's almost, we had two references during the date to his childhood, and it comes across as him throwing a tantrum, as a child would.
I mean, really, because it seems like we're kind of like tiptoeing towards that scene. I'll just say really the only note that I have, because we already iterated it, I said it feels very high school, the conversation that they're having back and forth. But for all of my back and forth qualms about the awkwardness, I will say it's incredible acting on, and I always get his name pronounced wrong, so I'm going to try it, Vincent D'Onofrio?
I'll take it.
Okay, it's great acting on his part because there's right at the tail end of that scene where she's like, I don't know how I feel. He has like this subtle quiver to his lips, and you can just see how truly distraught he is. And I liked it.
Yeah. Now, I have to reveal, as I'm watching this episode in a note-taking mindset, I had that question in the back of my mind that we started with. Is the violence gratuitous? And we've had such a build-up to Fisk of him being someone to fear that they had to do something. I feel like they had to go that far because after this one guy gets his head bashed in with a bowling alley, then impales himself at the end of the episode. You got to do something to say Fisk is someone to be feared, that you're going to impale yourself. Mm-hmm. And so in some ways I feel like it's not necessarily gratuitous. They had to give an audience a reason that someone would do that to themselves.
Yeah, it definitely has purpose. So just to describe that final scene, after Fisk is visibly hurt from Vanessa, we find ourselves with Anatoly and Wesley in a vehicle as they're discussing exactly what happened back at the base where the man in the black mask took them down. Anatoly discusses that he wants to put the past behind them and work together, but of course, Wesley waxes poetically about the past and how it's never truly erased. He gets a phone call confirming which side of the vehicle Anatoly is on, and unfortunately for Anatoly, he was not wearing his seatbelt, and Fisk quickly takes care of him.
Yeah, safety first. Safety first.
Right? A completely different scene if he would have been wearing the seatbelt.
Yeah, how do you imagine how would you do that? Hey, sir, Anatoly, do you mind unbuckling first? So, is that a basic movie trope? Because like I'm thinking of like The Dark Knight, and before Harvey Dent shoots the driver in the back of the head, he puts on a seatbelt.
Mm-hmm.
Like they weren't wearing seatbelts. Is that just a thing in movies that I just have never picked up on, that they intentionally don't wear seatbelts?
You know, it's kind of because don't they also like remove the headrest because it blocks the people in the back with the camera? It's I guess it's just one of those visual vocabulary things that we've grown to accept with movies and TV shows.
Yeah, I think that has to be it.
Mm-hmm. But no, I was going to say, I think having Wesley, go on about the past was such a great encapsulation of Anatoly's story. We obviously start with the dive back into their history, and then they have this reconciling over Simon's body in the hospital with, how they're going to put the past behind them and move forward and move past being softened by this land of riches. And here's Wesley, the practical person, being like, your past never really changes. It's always there.
Oh yeah, and so I like that you bring that up, because you have that for Anatoly and Vladimir. We mentioned how the episode is alluded to his past twice, and so I think that also has a nice end of ending for the Russians, but a foreshadowing for Fisk of his past is important.
Yeah, I like that read a lot, and I mean to continue on with showing how Fisk's childhood propels his actions forward. Fisk is absolutely terrifying in this scene. Take away the fact, we talked about it, take away the fact that he decapitates Anatoly. He completely manhandles Anatoly in a way that shows Anatoly never had a chance in this fight. Right.
He never had a chance. Well, and in the comic, and if you played, well, if you, the listener have, I know Trey has, the PS4 Spider-Man game, and you start off with Kingpin, he is known that he's not a fat man. He is a built man, and all of that is, that bulk is strength.
Yep. And I made a comparison to it earlier with his motivations as a character to Thanos. I mean, the way that he handles Anatoly here kind of feels like the same way that Thanos handled Hulk in the beginning of Infinity War. It's just like methodical and done away with quickly.
Yeah, I don't know why this popped into my head. The Ben incarnation of Daredevil, it was Michael Clark Duncan that played Kingpin. Another big, so another big muscular guy to kind of show that aspect of that character.
Again, just to kind of play off how they've been building this anxiety and awkwardness, it really services the rage that we get here towards the end.
Right. So what are your overarching concluding thoughts on this episode?
Just to kind of finally round out that scene, I do want to add this in real quick. Wesley, again, is the true MVP of this episode. He's the kind of right-hand man who will suffer getting blood splattered on his face, but will still offer his boss a clean towel before wiping his own.
Has there been an episode that he has not been the MVP?
No, I don't think so. Wesley,
not for us.
We really should... that'd be fun to start awarding who the MVP of the episode is and keep track of it as we continue on.
That's it. I'm down. I just wrote it. Wesley MVP.
All right. We need to listen back to the previous one, see if we can derive who our MVP would have been and keep track going forward. But regarding my thoughts overall, I think it's been pretty clear how much or how uncomfortable the Fisk stuff was for me. It just felt like a very uneven episode. I do like that it starts off as this, I'm Daredevil, all I have to do is apply pressure and I'll get what I want. But I like that they flip that on its head, and we see throughout the entirety of the episode that the pressure is actually being applied to him unknowingly. And I thought that was kind of a cool way to do it. Although, as you said, with the trope of the women in the refrigerator, that kind of makes it uneven as well.
For me, I think they did a good job with the Russians and Fisk and kind of showing, because this is the first time we really get to see him as crime boss. Towards the very end, and those really brief scenes about wanting to make a deal with the Russians. Otherwise, it's all been very vulnerable and with Vanessa. So I liked those aspects of this episode. This character building for Fisk and character building around that criminal world. It's a Daredevil. You have to have Daredevil in the episode, I guess. And I get the character that they built with that story. I'm just now watching it, I kind of wish they would have had a different way to do it. Honestly, you probably could have taken that aspect out and me just watch the Fisk Russian scenes and the Ben and Karen scenes, and I would have enjoyed it. Mm-hmm. I mean, not that I didn't enjoy the episode this time, but I don't think I would have thought, this, I wish Daredevil would have been in it. I would have enjoyed seeing just those characters.
I can see that. But that will do it for our discussion of Season 1, Episode 4, In the Blood. And of course, as you know by now, we do like to end with a question for you all to chime in on our social media. So with that being said, Jude, if you could bring back any villain in the MCU proper, who would it be?
Wow. I know who my first answer was when you texted me that question.
I think we both were under the impression that our answers are going to be the same, and we intentionally decided not to reveal it so that we could have a live telling of it here.
Yeah, but then the first one that popped into my head was something different.
Really? Because I have three.
Okay, so I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to do the one that I thought you would have, that I have. And then second is the one that just popped into my head this time. Okay. So the first one was Justin Hammer, and the second one was Claw.
So no, I'm actually really surprised, but those are actually good answers. I really would love to see Justin Hammer, although, and this could be my own ignorance regarding the comics, I don't know if you can still have Justin Hammer around without Tony Stark. That's actually a direct question.
I think you can. I think the way the MCU is, you can still make that work.
Okay.
Right. Like I could see, well, it depends on how you want to run some storylines and how much retconning-ish we would let them do and forgive. Right. So in Iron Man 3, you had AIM, Advanced Idea Mechanics. I could see a way where you could bring back Justin Hammer and maybe some kind of relationship with AIM and bringing that back. And we could still make that work as Hammer's trying to fill the technological void that Stark is leaving, even if it's a bit part and he is outfitting tech for other villains, so to speak. But I love the actor, and I just love how he played that character. And I love the actor, Sam Rockwell, in almost everything he's in. So I would love just to see more of him.
Yeah, any excuse to get him back.
Oh, yeah. And then Claw is I was shocked when they killed him, and I was like, wow.
So unceremoniously, too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so who are yours? Because I thought for sure, for some reason, we'd be on the same.
I will say honorable mention definitely would have been Justin Hammer, but that's not who I thought you thought I was getting. I thought you were under the impression that I wanted Killmonger back, who I would love to see him back, because I think he is one of the villains that, even though his methods obviously were not right, his idea was right, and he even got T'Challa to change his ways. So it'd be interesting to see him still around and what effect that he would be having in the universe as this kind of villain that has lingered. But that's not my number one. Honestly, who I would like to see return to the MCU would be Ultron. I really enjoy the idea of Ultron, and to see him kind of be this persistent villain that kind of rises to kind of give the Avengers more problems just seems really interesting to me.
Yeah, I wouldn't be opposed to that. And I feel like I maybe have to go rewatch it again. I feel like they tried to make sure with dialogue or whatever, that they kind of closed that door. You know, I mean, you almost kind of had to, otherwise there's no way you could end that movie, right? If he consciously escaped through the internet or something. Ultron in the comic was actually a creation of Hank Pym, not Tony Stark. I mean, he did create Vision just in the comic, but he gave them fits, you know, in that similar way. It wasn't as quite as easy to get rid of as, not that it was easy. It took the whole Avengers, you know, to get rid of him in the MCU. But in the comic, they had ways to bring him back, and I'm sure they could find ways to do it here.
Oh yeah, they most definitely they could if they wanted to. And just to round it off, my third person would have been, and this is more so because I like the actor. I mean, the character was fine, but Obadiah Stane. I think it would have been cool to see him stick around a little bit longer, but kind of similar point with Justin Hammer. I don't know if that's a character you can keep around now that Tony Stark has exited the MCU.
Right. And it's interesting because especially early on Phase 1, and I'm sure we'll address this at some point, they weren't shy about here's our big bad and we're going to kill him in the end. Mm-hmm. You know, it wasn't until later that, you know, I think with Loki, where villains started not just spilling over to other movies, but surviving. Yeah.
Yeah, Obadiah Stane definitely was their precedent that they set to do away with the villain early on. And as you said, we definitely see it change moving forward. But yeah, if you would like to chime in with who you would like to see villain-wise back into the MCU, we'd love to hear from you by adding us at MCU Need to Know on Twitter or tagging us on Instagram at MCU Need to Know as well. Or you can write to us at mcuneedtoknow@gmail.com, whether it's comments regarding this question or if you'd like to chime in with the episode itself.
And of course, we'd appreciate the help by leaving a rating on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast, and because that surely will help us out in growing an audience. And the best way is to share with your friends.
Yeah. And again, thank you so much for doing this with me, Jude.
Absolutely. Can't wait till next week.
See you all next week.
So I was going to say, this next scene starts with, okay, so I'll get to start again. Sorry. This next scene starts with that, damn it. I'm trying.
No, you're good. You're good. You got it.
Okay. So this next scene, really, I found it interesting because it started with this jarring cut to a beaten Claire fallen. So like the camera's on the ground, or a really low angle, I can't remember which, and Claire just falls to the ground and she's clearly beaten, right? And so it was such a jarring transition, but like that starts the scene, and then from there we basically get to see Claire and Karen. Damn it. Last try, then you got it.
You got this. You got it.
Okay. So in this next scene, we're back with Claire, and it starts with this low angle camera on the ground cut of, you know, you basically frame is clear. Karen, damn it, it's not Karen.
You want me to do it or one more shot?
Let me have. I'm trying to break it up for you, and so you know what I mean.
Yeah.
You go ahead.
Okay. So after the dating scene, we find ourselves back with Claire, who is incredibly beaten up and bloodied. She's being interrogated to reveal the man in the blast. Hey, there's my turn. Oh, God dang. All right.